welcome everyone. This is Grandmaster Sam Shankland, and this will be the introductory video to explain what you're going to get in this course, what you can expect, and all that. This is a course on tactics in the Grunfeld and on the sort of Grunfeld themes. Now, I have to be very clear right from the start. This is not an openings course. I talk a little bit about opening theory in a couple of various spots, and there's no doubt that it has some presence, but this is not a repertoire series. It's not like I'm saying, look, in this position you should play this, in this position you should play that. Because especially in an opening as dynamic as the Grunfeld, the theory is constantly changing, and I think it makes a lot more sense to let people learn that stuff on their own, just because it's relatively straightforward to do. You can sort of just look up games and see which moves work and which ones don't, and the computer can tell you that probably just as well as I can. What I have done instead is amass a collection of games, most of which are just part of the tactics section of this course, where I've chosen 50 tactics in the Grunfeld, or Grunfeld middle games that I've given to you as to try to solve. Now, my hope is that you will try to solve all the tactics first, then go over the complete game section, and then try to solve the tactics again. You know, maybe write them down on a separate piece of paper or something, and see if you've seen anything differently. Because the complete game section talks a lot about the various themes in the Grunfeld, which are the sort of pawn breaks Black can make to try to attack white center, and stuff like that. So I definitely think it's helpful to see those, but in addition, it really helps you find candidate moves. And I think that's what matters the most, because in the Grunfelds, there's all sorts of rules, there's all sorts of guidelines, just like any other middle game. But the Grunfeld specifically, you have to be ready to hang the rules at any given moment in favor of tactics. And that's why this is mainly a tactics course, because strategically, Black's position is somewhat suspect. White is given a big center, and Black has to break down that center, or else he is just going to be worse. That's kind of how the Grunfeld works. And according to all the games being played nowadays, Black's results are fine. He is successfully breaking down White's center a fair share of the time, and his position is okay. But this is the skill that really has to come. And when White does something insolent, like make a move like h3 or a3 at some point that doesn't help him develop, when Black's already had in development, that's when you know you have to strike. And I've given a whole bunch of positions where in most cases it's Black to move and he's trying to crash through. But at the same time, there's going to be positions that represent games where White has played well, and you have to find ways to maintain the balance, because after all, you are playing Black. If your opponent plays well, usually you're the one under pressure instead of the other way around. There's even a few games in the course where you're playing White and showing what to do against Grunfeld's gone wrong. And it is my goal to present people with the kind of tactical ideas, patterns, candidate moves that are necessary to play Grunfeld middle games well. All right, so you've now seen the introductory video. So we're going to go over now is look at a bunch of thematic games in the Grunfeld. Hopefully by this point you've already taken a shot at trying to solve the tactics in the course, which should be touched separately, and then scored your solutions, or not scored them, but wrote them down so you sort of have a sense of what you were thinking and whatnot. And then next up, what I'd like you to do is watch these games and try to interact with them when you can. In general, this course is a little bit less interactive than the ones I normally do, just because there are so many tactics, and that's sort of the spot that really stretches your brain as opposed to being talked at. But when you watch these illustrative games, which show a lot of the key themes in the Grunfeld, including making use of your lead in development, using the correct pawn levers to open the position, making the proper exchanges, things like this, when you are starting to consider all of those, this will not only help you play the Grunfeld better overall, but hopefully help you find candidate moves more easily that will help you find the solutions in the tactics section. So knock yourself out with this, and then once you're done, go ahead and try again with all the tactics, and hopefully you'll see an improvement. Thanks. Bye-bye. All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to proceed along with the next part of the course. So far, we've looked at all the tactics, which are definitely a big part of the Grunfeld, undoubtedly so, and the Grunfeld is in its nature a tactical opening, and you can quickly find yourself in an unpleasant position if you don't use energetic means to punish your opponent when they do too ambitious things or when they lag behind in development. We saw a whole section on that, and the Grunfeld is certainly not an opening to play if you don't feel comfortable in giving a somewhat suspect position that you have to justify with concrete play, stuff like that. In any case, what we're going to look at now is a section more on complete games and on actual pawn structures that you'll see in the Grunfeld, and sort of what happens if you don't just get to chop White's head off when he blunders into some trickery. So one of the typical pawn structures that we'll sometimes see in the Grunfeld is a blocked center. Now, usually this is not something I'd recommend, but there are definitely cases where it's correct. So we're going to go over a very nice game played by Garry, who's in his nature more of a technical player, but is also very good at the Grunfelds, both in the tactical and in the technical sort of phases. So in this game, he's playing black against Luke van Wely. It starts off, obviously, as a Grunfeld. And White chooses the bishop c4 variation. And his point of developing his pieces this way is that after the inevitable c5, knight e2, and knight c6, bishop e3, White has put together the strongest possible defense against the against the attack on the d4 pawn. There's the knight would undoubtedly be more actively placed on f3, but the problem is if this knight were dragged to f3, that black would have a resource like bishop g4 available to remove the defender and as such put more pressure. In addition, there's always moves like queen a5 hanging over White's head, pinning the c3 pawn and threatening it. Well, here neither of these moves are an issue. If black were to play bishop g4, White always has f3 available. That's sort of the reason the knight went to e2 in the first place. Similarly, queen a5, White can just castle out of it. He totally doesn't care. Because the c3 pawn is not hanging, so he doesn't have to burn a tempo on a move like queen d2, which could even allow a queen trade. So the point of White's setup is that it's very, very compact, and it does a very good job of defending his center, and frankly, there's no real way for black to attack it that effectively. But what black can do is point out that White's pieces are a little bit poorly placed. So, for example, after castle, black has a whole host of moves here. I've always been impartial to queen c7 myself. This is my favorite move in the position. In some cases, black would like to increase the pressure on the d4 pawn by means of rook d8. He can also simply continue his development with a move like b6. And I've actually played this move, I think, not quite every game I've played in this position, but quite a few. Definitely my last two in the Grunfeld, I played queen c7. In addition, White has to look out for tactics with cd4 and knight takes d4, so if he were to just go about his merry way with, I don't know, h3 or something, you can take and knight takes d4 with the point that this bishop on c4 is hanging. In any case, since I'm not really trying to discuss the opening, Kamsky chose a very different approach for this game, which is he chased the bishop away. This move knight a5 is quite good because the bishop on c4, it's an active piece pointing at the king side and everything, but it's not a stable piece. And by playing knight a5, black forces it backwards. And then black played b6. At basically any moment, he's totally happy to just give a pawn with dc5 because after something like dc5, for instance, queen c7, takes, White's proud center is long since gone, and black's pieces are more active. The rook on a8 has already been developed, and black can continue with bishop e6 or bishop a6 and plant the knight on c4, and black's going to be fine. And after queen d2, black even encouraged White to go ahead and do that by playing the move e5. Now, if White were to take on c5 here, and black plays something like bishop e6, I believe black has full compensation for his missing pawn because White's pieces really don't coordinate well. A move like knight c4 could be hanging over White's head. And the problem is this extra pawn is these doubled pawns on c3 and c5, and if White ever tries to exchange one off with something like cb6, black develops his rook too. So, in any case, these are sort of the kind of sacrifices you'll see. In addition, you'll note that this knight on e2 is really awful. I mean, that knight really wants to be on f3, and the pawn on e5 thoroughly dominates it. It's very hard for White to even find a constructive move here. And black can play queen c7, rook fd8, knight c4 could be coming pretty soon. I think black is fine, presumably Kamsky did too. But what e5 really does is provoke White into advancing d5. And this leads to the sort of locked center pawn structure that you see where black has played e5, compelling White to play d5. So at this point, there's really not that much action going on in the center, and all has been locked. And it seems like it should just be good for White, because White has extra space, and because White has more pawns in the center. But in reality, there's a lot more to it than that. These positions have to be assessed very carefully. And I believe these structures are basically a disaster for black if, and only if, this c3 pawn is back on b2. Which is a completely different opening, essentially, because in order for that to happen, White cannot be playing c takes d5 and e4, where he gets the big center in the first place. So those kinds of structures should be avoided. Because if you could imagine that pawn going back there, white would have a very easy way to open the queenside with b2 to b4. That opens the c-file where the protected passed pawn on d5 can really become useful in controlling key squares. And in general, I think that black would just be worse if white could pull this off. Maybe much worse. But as is, the queenside is completely locked, and it's very hard to see how white can even try to open it. The knight on a5 is a little bit weirdly placed. Ideally, the knight belongs on d6 because, knights belong in front of passed pawns. One nice point about the knight on a5 is it really precludes white from making the advance a4 and a5 himself. So it's very hard for white to do very much. And then if white tries to open the position on the king side with a move like f4, he's always going to be running into moves like e takes f4, and then the black bishop on g7 is opened up. So I actually think black is doing pretty well here. But it's all because of a few things. First, that white's pawn is on c3, meaning the queenside can't be opened. And second, because he can't get a4, a5 in. So black plays a very typical Grunfeld move. And this is almost like a King's Indian inside of Grunfeld. He would just start throwing pawns with f5. So white could play f3 to try to solidify his center. But I presume Kamsky would have played f4, which will lead to a pretty similar position to the game. And after bishop f2, black should play c4. This is very important. We'll get to why in a bit. And after something like bishop c2, g5, I don't think there's too much need to discuss this position because it's very, very similar to what we got in the game. So we'll just skip over that. In any case, in the game, white included the moves bishop g5, in this position. He played bishop g5 first, queen e8, and then he played f3. It's important to note that white can never really get away with f4. He'd like to, but to try to open the position and make use of his passed pawn, but this move always runs into some kind of trouble. For instance, black can try something like h6, pointing out that after bishop to h4, e takes f4, white cannot comfortably take this pawn back because there's going to be a fork with g5. In addition, black can consider something like f takes e4. Probably if he's going to do fe4, it makes more sense to do it directly because after takes, he can go knight c4, and he doesn't have to worry about queen d3 because the pawn on g6 isn't hanging. And after something like the knight coming to d6 with tempo, and black is ready for moves like knight takes e4 and bishop f5, and his pieces all spring to life, this is just bad news for white. So white instead plays f3. And now f4, I think, would be a pretty serious strategic error. Because what happens now is black is close to the position on the king side, and that's the part of the board where he's going to try to win the game. He's going to go h6, g5, and sort of launch a standard King's Indian attack. But there's a very key difference here, which is that white gets the move c4 in. Which, this does a lot of things, but most importantly, it gives his knight access to the c3 square, and it also opens up this diagonal for the bishop. If the white bishop comes to e1, eventually it will kick the knight off of its perch on a5, and then white can get a4, a5 through, and get his own counterplay on the queen side going. If white can play a4, a5, he will probably just win the game on the queen side with very little resistance. Now, all is not lost by any stretch, because it will take a long time for white to do that. He has to play bishop g5 to h4 to e1, then move the queen away to harass that knight, and even then he has to go a4, a5. That takes a lot of time. Black can try to prevent it. He can get a lot of his own counterplay on the king side, so it's not like his position is lost or anything like that, but I think it makes a lot more sense for black to start with the move c4. This pushes the bishop somewhere a little inconvenient, and now and only now black plays f4. At this point, the c3 square has been deprived for the white knight on e2 has been deprived of the c3 square that it would love to go to. And in addition, the bishop on g5 now no longer has a clean route to challenge the knight on a5. And the knight on a5 can basically just sit there. It probably will want to go to d6 at some point, but it turns out that there's really no way for white to force open file on the queen side. And if there's no open lines over there, white never wants to advance his d-pawn because it will just be surrounded and captured. And otherwise, his position is just awful. Black is ready to play h6 and g5 and open the king side. So white tried king h1. His plan with this move was to try to play g3 and get his rook to g1 to contest the open g file, but he's playing on the wrong side of the board. Although, to be honest, I think his position is just bad. It's possible he's already strategically lost, which is a very strong word, but it may well be justified. So Kamsky continues along with h6, bishop h4, g5. This is very typical. Once the position has been closed, it takes more of a King's Indian character, and black wants to get his kingside attack going. And after bishop e1, there was no need at all to rush. And this is where a position like this one is very different from the King's Indian. Normally, for a King's Indian player, they're seeing white really breaking them on the queen side, and they have to just start throwing stuff and attacking the king and they have to do it right away because they're losing the game very quickly on the other side of the board. Well, here white has nothing meaningful at all going on the other side of the board, and black can take his sweet time. Kamsky played bishop d7. I don't know if this is the best move, and I don't really care. It's more than enough, and he is simply taking all the time he needs because there's nothing that white can do, and he's simply bringing out his pieces and getting ready to bring the a8 rook into the game. So white played g3. I don't think he ever wants to take on f4. This is more a prophylactic measure so that black will struggle to play f4 himself, because then white could play g takes f4, so black's pawns have to stay put. But again, on this side of the board, black is just going to have a much easier time because that's the direction his pawns point. So queen h5 is played, knight g1. I guess white was worried about bishop h3 or f takes g3 potentially undermining the pawn on f3. But knight g1 is a very sad move. And I really like the way Kamsky played the next few moves. He just did not rush. I would be very tempted to start throwing g4, and I think the computer even likes moves like that at some point. But Kamsky was just super patient, realized that white is not doing anything constructive, and simply improved all of his pieces. He started with rook f7. This move serves two purposes. First, the bishop on g7 is misplaced, not wildly so because it's such a closed position, but it would much rather come around to like c5, for example. And you frequently see this maneuver in the King's Indian of rook f7 and bishop f8. But in addition, there's even more than that black can hope for, because the last piece that's not really participating is the rook on a8. And it would love to come to f8, but as Kamsky shows, there's even a better square for it. And after queen g2, before black plays bishop f8, cutting off the last rank, black first puts his rook on g8, anticipating that the g-file will soon open up. And as a result, white has a really hard time holding the position together. So white plays bishop d1. This strikes me as a move of a desperate man. He's not doing anything. He's just hoping to stop g4, but he has to realize that there's no way he's going to stop it in the long run. So black plays rook g8, rook b1, and I don't really understand what this rook is doing. Bishop f8. And black is ready to start using this bishop on the dark squares. It's amazing how white has been able to drum up absolutely nothing on the queen side, and black has just been step by step improving all of his pieces. This is the sign of a very strong player playing in such a closed position as well. But and it's not super typical for the Grunfeld, but this specific pawn structure where we get e5 forcing d5 and then black gets c4 in is pretty common, and I think Kamsky really put on a clinic here. And going back, if you could imagine if white could instead, if white had been able to play c4 a while ago and black's c4 pawn were back on c5, and white could go bishop takes a5, b takes a5, and rook b7, then all bets are off. Anything can happen. I mean, black still clearly has counterplay, but at that point, we're clearly having a double-edged fight. Well, at this point, white just has no counterplay whatsoever. So white tries bishop e2. My guess is this was prophylaxis. He was hoping to prevent the black knight from coming to d6 by chaining it to the defense of the b5 pawn, but doesn't really help white very much because black doesn't need that knight just yet. So black starts with bishop c5, white plays bishop f2, and then black dropped back to d6. I guess he was just happier with that bishop being on f2 than on e1. I mean, now white's queen is looking pretty silly. So, rook b2 is played. And again, Kamsky continued along with the exact same policy of playing slowly, in a closed position when there's no counterplay. And again, this to me this sort of feels atypical for the Grunfeld, but when the position gets, but in this specific flavor of it, it's an important skill to have. So rook f6 was played. What Kamsky is planning with this move is he wants to double his rooks on the g-file, but he doesn't want to get himself trapped. So he's clearing his queen away for his queen to get away, and then he can potentially play moves like h5 and g4. So after white played bishop back to e1, I guess black could have tried making a draw with bishop c5, bishop f2, bishop d6, but understandably Kamsky was much more ambitious than that. So queen e8, white played knight h3. I don't even know what else to suggest. And black played rook fg6. And again, there's really not much that white can do about eventually g4 coming through. Black can take all the time he wants to prepare it, and there's nothing white can do in the long run to stop it. So he tried knight f2, overprotecting the g4 square even further, but black simply threw h5. And it's important to note that while the pawn on g3 is sort of a deterrent against g4 because g takes f4 is sort of quote-unquote threat, it's clear the threat is always stronger than the execution, because white never wants to take on f4 and open the g-file voluntarily. It's only if black plays g4. In fact, if he does this, his queen is just trapped and he can resign immediately. So white tried playing g4 himself just to try to keep the position close, but that's not going to work because it leaves black with an open h-file. And Kamsky just simply, I really like his next move. He said, look, I brought my rook from h6 to g6 to try to push g4 through. I have now provoked white into playing g4. My rook no longer serves a purpose on g6. I'm simply going to bring it right back where it came from on h6, where all of a sudden it looks amazing because that previously, when white's pawn was on g3, there was no clear way to open the h-file. Now, black has a very straightforward plan to double his rooks on the h-file. He can play king g7, rook h8, and eventually he will take on g4, and the open h-file should spell white's doom. So white took h5 directly, but it doesn't really help him very much. After rook takes h5, knight g4, black, of course, should not blunder into knight f6. He wants to double rooks on the g-file, but it has to be on the h-file, excuse me, but it has to be done intelligently, because if he plays rook to g7, knight f6 is pretty painful. Instead, black plays king g7, which is a very strong move, covering the f6 square with his king, and now he's ready to play rook g to h8. So bishop d1, rook g h8, rook ff2, and white is adopting a very defensive position, but it's not going to work out. So rook h3 is played. Kamsky is now ready to invade with queen h5. White played queen f1, and at this point, now that the knight on g4 is no longer protected by a piece, black can achieve an easily won position simply by taking it, forcing this pawn to take. Now the f4 pawn becomes a protected passer, but much more importantly, the pawn on e4 is just going to fall. There's no way that white's going to be able to put enough defenders on it. So black immediately increased the pressure with queen g6, bishop f3, and now bishop c5, including another important piece in the attack, rook e2. And finally, at long last, it took a very, very long time, but ultimately the last black piece comes into the game with knight to b7. And that knight, I've always said it belongs on d6, and that is ultimately where it arrives. Now, black was prioritizing his other pieces first, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to, pick which pieces you think are worth improving. It's not like black was twiddling his thumbs playing king f7, king g7 over and over again instead of improving his knight. But now that all the other pieces have found their best squares, that knight comes to d6. Note that the pawn on c4 is not hanging to anything right now. And once that knight comes to d6, the pressure on the e4 pawn will clearly be too much to handle. So white tried queen g2, overprotecting the pawn, knight d6. And now that the knight is left a5, it makes some sense for white to try to open the queenside with a4. But this also highlights the incredible effectiveness of the knight on d6, and another key point of the importance of having played c4. First of all, by playing c4, black now has the c5 square for his bishop, which gained him a lot of space. But secondly, by doing that, he's also prevented white from playing c4, so that now, if white ever plays a5, black can easily play b5 in response to keep the queenside closed, and it's not like white's opening anything up. While if white had a pawn on c4, then he would be very capable of opening the queenside by playing a5. At this point, it probably wouldn't help him very much because he'd still be completely crushed, but it's definitely a key point to note. So Kamsky played queen h7. I guess he just wanted to add more pressure on the h-file. I don't really see too much other point to it, but it doesn't ruin anything. It's a totally fine move. So white played queen f1. I don't even know why again, but there's not much to do. So king f6 was played. Kamsky's just getting his pieces to the most solid position. He's also clearing away for his queen. Fanueli just has to sit and wait. It's a really sad thing to have to do, but sometimes it's what you got to do. Kamsky played very well to put him at this point. And now black plays queen d7. He's using the entire board. The pawn on a4 is hit, and if black can take it, I'm sure he just will be happy to. He's not worried about the a-file because he can always play a5, and then since white's not doing anything, he just comes back and plays the same position with an extra pawn as well. So white played rook to a2 to overprotect the pawn. And now, again, I really like the way Kamsky just did not rush at any point this game. He, again, plays very calmly. His queen was on h7 on the useful h-file, but it was in the wrong order, and he sets up the proper Alekhine's gun with rook to h6. The point being that now he's ready to bring his queen back to h7, and that the heaviest piece is in the back. So queen f1, queen h7, queen g2, and then finally, at long last, black found the breakthrough here, which It's not wildly difficult, and I know we've done a lot of tactics, but still, I'd like to invite my viewers to pause their videos to try to find the move that Black played to finish off the game, because he's played very strategically so far, but ultimately this is sort of a tactics course, and I find that often, even in very strategic games, tactics finish them off at the end. So this is your last chance to pause your video before I go forward. 3, 2, 1. All right, we're going. So White sort of has something that looks like a fortress. He doesn't have any. All of his weakness seem reasonably well protected, but the e4 pawn is the big one, and Black can simply take on f3. Following queen takes f3, the other rook comes into h3. This is another key point of having set up the Alekhine's gun. If the rook were back on h8, Black wouldn't have this resource. Queen g2. And now it looks like f3 is winning a piece on the spot, but it doesn't. It definitely wins the game, but White can play, for example, queen f1, and it's not like the rook is hanging on e2. But instead, Black played king e7. And in fact, White just resigned here, because there is absolutely nothing he can do about f3 next move, because f3 is forking his queen and his rook. He cannot stop f3 from happening, so he must move one of these pieces, but if he does, for instance, say queen f1, the e4 pawn falls, and once the e4 pawn falls, just forget about it. f3 is coming, and then knight g3 check could be coming, and the whole house just falls down. So Fanuele just resigned here. I think it was a totally justified resignation, and it really, I thought Kamsky played exceptionally well to demonstrate the way that you'd play one of these locked Grunfeld structures, where Black has successfully managed to play e5, force White into playing d5, and then gotten the move c4 through. He clearly restricted any counterplay. White had no active play at any point the entire game, and Black used all the squares available to him and all the plans available to him. In any case, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you for the next lesson. All right, welcome back. So we're going to proceed along with the next lesson, and this game is all about the weakness of the c3 pawn when Black is able to trade pieces. So in the Grunfeld, the standard beginning of the exchange variation goes something like this. Now, normally White will start with the c takes d5 move order, which gives him a little bit more options, but for whatever reason, he played knight f3 in this game. It doesn't really matter. It transposes to one of his main lines, but by playing this way, White disallows himself from playing like the bishop c4 knight e2 variation we saw in the previous game. But anyhow, we see sort of the beginning of the exchange variation here, and we saw a lot of these positions before. Bishop c5, bishop e3, queen a5, and we saw a lot of positions after queen d2 in the course, and we'll see this position I think again at some point. But in this game, White played bishop d2, and with this move, he's solidifying his setter even more, but he's also losing more time. He's playing bishop d2, moving the same piece twice in the opening when he's already behind on development. So one thing that Black can do to alleviate any problem with a space advantage is to trade a bunch of pieces. The other thing he can do is break it up at the source. So what we're going to see this game is when Black sort of uses a hybrid of both of these strategies to really nullify White's space advantage. And in addition, when you consider that White has a strong central pawn mass, the more pieces that are on the board, the more valuable that's going to be. While ultimately, if you took all the pieces off the board, I actually think it would be in Black's favor to have outside pass pawn potential. Now, that's a long way away from now, but as we'll see, in a position as open as an open Grunfeld, you can frequently see quite a lot of trades. And in fact, that's what we see this game, where Black really highlights a lot of important themes. So the game, Black castles, bishop e2, Black plays bishop g4. His moves have clear purpose and intention. They're trying to undermine the pawn on d4. Castle, rook d8. And now White played knight g5, which is a mistake. He probably should play d5 and just pitch the pawn on c3 and hope for compensation. I would probably somewhat prefer Black in that position, but it's certainly not over. There's a lot of play left for both sides. But after the move he played, knight g5, White ends up in a really bad way. So Black takes on e2, queen e2, and we see White's point is that if he were to take on d4, if Black were to take on d4, pointing out that this pawn is attacked a whole bunch of times and only defended once, the problem is after c takes d4 back, White is gaining a very critical tempo on this queen. And it's not so easy to find a great square for the queen either. I mean, if she goes back to, say, like c7, she can get hit by rook b1. And white wants to be ready to play a move like d5 next. In a lot of cases, he's even happy to just pitch an exchange. And he's also ready to play a move like queen f3 to harass the pawn on f7. But going back here, black has a very critical move, and one that I think we'll find very frequently in the Grunfeld. And I know that I've seen there's going to be another game right after this one showing what happens in a similar position when black doesn't play it. So I'd like to give everyone a chance to pause their videos and see if they can figure out how to use a hybrid of thinking about destroying white's center as well as potentially trading pieces to mitigate any space advantage that your opponent might have, while also calculating concrete variations to justify the way that you're playing. So going back, or I'll give you your last chance to pause your video, but I'm going to go ahead. So the best move, and the one that Smirin played, is queen to a6. And this is a very important move because he is threatening an exchange of queens, and the real problem is that the white queen has nowhere to go. She would like to go to f3, and we're going to see why this is important later, that we started with queen a6. Because this, instead of defending d4, it counterattacks the pawn on f7. But the problem for white is black can make the ugly move f6. Now, there is no doubt that this is strategically undesirable, but if there's one thing you've gleaned from this series, it should be that you have to just break the rules in the Grunfeld if the position calls for it, and if the calculation calls for it. f6 blunts the bishop, but at the same time it hits the knight. The knight cannot go forward to e6 because the queen on a6 is covering that square. The only place it can go is back to h3, and black can simply pick off this pawn on d4, and he's going to be a pawn up. It's extremely important that black start with the move queen a6 right away, because if he instead plays c takes d4, in general c takes d4 is not a move you want to play in the Grunfeld strategically. If you have a tactical reason to do it, for example, like I'm just taking that pawn for nothing, go for it. There's every reason for it. But by playing it when it's not forced, you often open the c file for white to use, which he's often better equipped to use than you are. And in addition, you trade off his potential weakness on c3. So we're going to see you give him more squares to work with. So in this particular case, cd is an undesirable move, and the point after queen a6 is this does not simply transpose. If white were to play queen f3 here, black now cannot get away with the move f6, which is a real shame. If he plays f6, in the previous position, there was a black pawn on c5 and a white pawn on c3, and white had to retreat the knight. Given that these pawns have been exchanged, white now has the additional resource at his disposal, queen b3 check, which is immediately devastating because black has no good way to respond to the check, and he's just going to lose a boatload of material. So f6 is losing, but other than that, it's actually not easy for black to come up with a constructive move to defend the f7 pawn. He probably should play rook f8, but that's a very, very sad move to have to play. And white can simply play something like bishop e3 or e5 to bolster his center, and I think that he has a very reasonable position. By starting with the move queen a6, black avoids this possibility. Following queen f3, f6, white cannot play queen b3 check through the pawn on c3, and as a result has to drop the pawn on d4. So you might say, well, queen f3 is a mistake. But unfortunately for white, there's just nothing else for him to do, because c takes d4 is coming next. If he starts with queen e3, for example, now since black didn't have to play f6 and this bishop is still open, c takes d4 just takes the d4 pawn for dead nothing. So white found the best move in a bad position, which is to take on a6. But after knight takes a6, his problems are anything but over. The d4 pawn is still under enormous pressure, and it's hit 3 times, and it cannot be defended a 3rd time. If white were to play knight f3, there is nothing stopping black from just chopping this pawn right off, and he remains a pawn to the good. So white has to play d5. And this is what I wanted to sort of talk about in terms of the weakness of the c3 pawn. When white plays d5 in these structures, previously we saw a structure like this. In this game, black played c4, which is once again the best move, like we'll often see. In the long run, it prevents white from playing c4, but it also fixes the pawn on c3 as a long-term weakness on a dark square. It clears the c5 square for black's knight. It's a very desirable move. And previously, we saw a case where black's pawn was on e5 instead, which led to a locked position. This one leads to a more open one. And in general, that would probably favor white if he had like a queen to work with. If there were queens on the board and white could, let's say black had a queen on a5 and white had a queen on h3. It's clear that white would get some attacking chances with this pawn majority. I mean, black would be forced into playing like moves like h5, potentially run into g4. As is, white has basically nothing to say about this this weak pawn on c3. In addition, black also has not by any stretch given up on the idea of breaking down white's center, and he can play e6 next move. So in order to deal with this threat of e6, white got rid of the bishop on d2 and played bishop e3. Once again, the best move in an unpleasant position, because if he did nothing, e6 was coming. So for example, if white tried to, I don't know, overprotect this pawn on c3 so that black couldn't add further pressure, black can just play e6. White cannot take it because the bishop on d2 is hanging, and black will end up a clean pawn up and completely winning. So bishop e3 makes sense in that regard. It also stops the knight from coming to the c5 square, and white points out that if black were to take on c3, he can just play rook a c1. So black, though, just continued simply with rook a c8. So this move overprotects c4 so that if white... So, for example, the game continued, bishop takes a7, and now after bishop takes c3, if white were to play rook a c1, and black simply retreated the bishop, or advanced it even to b2 to play, or no, here there's even bishop d2. But the point is, in none of these situations is the hanging pawn on c4 relevant. Well, going back a second ago, if black took here, this would be a big mistake, because after rook c1, white gets rook takes c4. After rook c8, white did not have to give the pawn on c3 for the pawn on a7. I mean, it's a pretty undesirable trade, given that black will get a pass pawn. But the problem is there's not much else. If white plays rook a c1, and black plays knight to c5, white certainly does not want to allow knight d3. He doesn't want to allow h6, kicking that knight away, and then knight takes e4. So he's pretty much forced to take on c5. But the more we're getting towards this bishop just lasering down on the pawn on c3, it becomes pretty easy for black to break it down. Already, black has a threat to play e6 because the knight is hanging on g5. So for example, let's say white retreats and black plays e6 anyway. After something like this, and black plays rook d3 next, it's just going to be such a nightmare for white to defend that c3 pawn in the short or the long run. Black can start playing moves like rook a5, forcing rook c2, and then rook a3. And he's really artificially isolated this c3 pawn. I mean, it was always isolated, but he's really fixed it as a long-term weakness that he can exploit. So white sort of accepted, look, I'm going to lose this pawn eventually. I might as well get the guy in a7 for my troubles. But the position gets really bad really fast. So bishop a7, bishop c3. Once again, rook c1. A does not win the c4 pawn, and B, now that the bishop on e3 is gone, it would run into bishop d2. So white tried rook b1, but black simply defended the pawn with rook d7. Bishop e3, bishop back to g7. And black was left with a very powerful pass c-pawn that just ran straight down the board on the next couple moves. With rook b5, c3, f4, c2, and the c-pawn just totally stole the show. Rook c1, rook c4. Now this pawn on e4 is hanging, and it's really hard to come up with anything constructive to do about it, because if e5, black can play something like f6 and open the position further. You could also play knight c7 and take on d5. That's probably easiest, something like this. If rook takes b7, rook takes d5, and see how much white will enjoy a rook landing on d1. There's all sorts of problems like that. So white tried a3. I guess he was just hoping to keep any unwanted guests off of b4. I guess after e5, even knight b4 would have been good. Everything was winning. And now black just went with the simple h6, kicking the white knight away. He took on e4, and it was clear that everything had gone horribly, horribly wrong, and black won pretty quickly. It went king f2, rook c7, bishop b6, rook c3, rook b2. I guess black was hoping to take on, or white was hoping to take on c2, and he managed, but it came at a very heavy price. Black took the pawn on a3, and after rook c2, first of all, white is still down a pawn for dead nothing, but also he's got so many hanging guys. Black could take on f4 if he wanted. He found an even better move, knight b4. This hits the rook, knight d3 is coming, knight d5 is coming, the pawn on f4 is still hanging. White's going to lose at least a second pawn and probably more. Went rook c8 check, king h7, rook d1, knight d3 check, king f1, knight takes f4. Black's now 2 pawns to the good. White definitely could have resigned, but he played on for a bit, so we'll just see the end. Rook e8, f5, bishop c7, rook d3, takes, rook b8. Guess white was hoping to take on b7, but obviously that does not happen. Rook b4, rook e8. Now black does not make a draw with rook back to e4. He defends more productively with bishop f6. Rook d8, knight c5. Black wants knight e4, I guess. d6 takes. Of course, bishop takes looks like a nice pin, but it does absolutely nothing because of a move like rook b1 check first, and then rook b2 check, and in addition, the rook on d8 is hanging. So that's no good. White has to take with the rook. He would have liked to have taken with the bishop, but he can't. Bishop g7, h4, and all of this. Realistically, none of this really matters, but still, for completeness' sake, I just thought I'd show how the game ended. It went takes, takes, and now black just set his pawns in motion. He probably could have just tried to queen the b pawn, but I like the way he played even more, getting the kingside going. And white resigned here with threats of moves like bishop d4 and rook b1. They're just going to be mate, and there's nothing white can do about it. So I thought this was a very convincing example from Smyrian, showing how to use the weakness of the c3 pawn as in the long term, which really was played very well. I think it showed that, especially in the endgame, if you can fix the pawn as a weakness, and once you've traded a bunch of pieces, it really works in black's favor. In any case, that's enough on this pawn structure, and I'll see you for the next lesson.